I first met Mike in 1964 when I came to Channel 2 to work on one of the first news magazines in Los Angeles TV history, Ralph Story's Los Angeles. Mike was in the newsroom, and since we both were USC graduates, he graduated in 1958, I graduated in 1961, we immediately hit it off. 2 years later, management discovered that they were paying a full-time writer to do field work and thought the money would be better spent if I went to the newsroom. So I ended up on the overnight with Mike producing the morning TV news with Joseph Benty. The news director had told Mike that as soon as he brought me up to speed to produce the news show, he could get off the overnight and back to regular daytime hours. Within 3 days, Mike was gone, and I was stuck producing the morning show for the next 2 months. Watching Mike in a busy newsroom was an education. All hell could be breaking around him, complete chaos with people screaming and running around, but Mike would sit there in the eye of the newsroom hurricane, quietly and patiently putting the newscast together. He never lost his cool or his temper and was a calming force in any breaking news situation. He spent nearly 4 decades writing and producing the news, welcoming and breaking in one generation after another of news writers, producers, reporters, and talent. He was always the voice of reason, making his points in a low and patient voice, reminding everyone that journalism was a sacred calling and that each of us had a responsibility to produce a newscast that was accurate and fair. Anyone who knew Mike then and now would refer to him as a gentle soul or the sweetest person I've ever met, and that was true. He treated everyone with respect and gentility. I only saw him lose his temper once in nearly half a century. We were sitting around at USC talking to some colleagues, and one was railing about his students, saying they were the dumbest group of stupid kids he had ever met. I could see in Mike's body language that he was getting angry. Finally, he stood up and said to the teacher, "There are no stupid students, just bad teachers," and walked out. Mike loved his students. When I left CBS to come to USC in 1974 to create the broadcasting sequence in the School of Journalism, Mike was one of the first persons I called to see if he would teach a class on television news production. He said he wasn't sure he could do it, but would be glad to give it a try. For the next 4 decades, Mike became a master teacher, beloved by all of his students for his professionalism, his generosity of spirit, and his kindness. He became their mentor, later their friend, and hundreds of students not only remember his class, but they also remember wonderful days spent with Skipper Mike on his boat talking and laughing about almost anything. Mike tried over and over again to get me to come on that boat, but I am a confirmed landlubber, so he finally gave up. But every time he was on his boat in Santa Monica Bay, he would call us and tell us to come out on the balcony and wave hello. I'll miss those phone calls. In his retired years, Mike became a fixture at USC Annenberg as a writing coach and a broadcast journalism teacher. In those dark days when he was taking final doses of chemotherapy, he told me he had worked out a formula where he knew exactly which days after a treatment he would feel well enough to come to USC and work with students. I asked him if it was too much for him, and he said, "I'm happiest when I'm working with the students. It's a joy to be with them." It was a joy to be with Mike. A month before he died, we were reflecting on how so many of our colleagues were dying off. I said to him, "Every time someone we know dies, I feel as if a piece of our history dies with them." He agreed, adding, "But look at the bright side. Just think how we could do the big news all over again, the celestial version with Jerry Dunphy, Bill Keane, Gil Stratton, Ralph Story, and Maury Green. And think of that newsroom staff with Nate Kaplan, Mike Gavin, Eli Bregman, Eric Schumann, Jim Vincent, Chuck Riley, Pat O'Reilly, and so many others." He stopped for a moment, and there was his familiar chuckle. "Doesn't sound all that bad. Don't worry, I'll save a place for you, and it won't be on the overnight." Rest in peace, dear friend. I'll never forget you. The next speaker is Pete Noyes, a man whom Mike always referred to as a living legend, the best journalist in the history of Los Angeles television news. He was Mike's lifelong friend and mentor. Pete Noyes.
Thank you. It's fitting that so many of you are here today to pay tribute to a man who embodied the attributes of a real journalist, one who left his mark on the history of TV news, not as we know it today in the digital world of Twitter, beauty queens turned weather girls, and car chases that light up the screens for hours. No, that wasn't Mike Daniels, not one iota of his persona. Mike polished his credentials as news producer in the company of those men who could move journalistic mountains. People who created the big news named Saltzman, O'Reilly, Fisher, Vincent, Kaplan, Gingold. I joined KNXT in 1961, wet behind the ears, not knowing a cutaway from a roll-through. But there was Mike, patiently teaching me the ropes and urging me not to get discouraged by the journalistic demons that haunted Gower Gulch. And Mike most certainly saved my TV career before it had barely started. For some ungodly reason, the news director decided I should produce the 11 o'clock news, and the second night on the job, I ended up in a collision course with the anchorman, whose name I won't mention because every Irishman knows not to speak ill of the dead. In those early days, we rehearsed the news in studio. That's right, we actually rehearsed it. This particular night, the anchorman was rehearsing at his lecture, a bimbo at his side, not his wife. He repeatedly turned to her to elaborate on my incompetence in the loudest possible terms. I was stationed inside the director's booth where special assignment reporter John Hart called me a coward for tolerating the anchor's insults. I finally lost my cool when the anchorman said a punk like me shouldn't be allowed in the building. I swung at the anchorman, missed, knocked over his lectern and watercress, then I tore up his script and stormed out of the building. But on the way out the door, there was Cool Hand Luke, Mike Daniels, with a new script in his hand, trying to salvage my career. Telling me, Pete, calm down. I'll take care of everything. Go home. The broadcast somehow got on the air with seconds to spare. I told my wife what had happened, and I was going to start looking for a job in the morning. The sun was barely up when I got a call from General Manager Bob Wood's secretary. She told me Mr. Wood wanted to see me at once. I was prepared for the worst, and when I met Wood, he told me, "Thank God for Mike Daniels. He certainly saved your job, and probably mine had we not gotten on the air." Wood's parting shot to me was, "Get back to work, and by the way, if you swing at that SOB again, I'll miss, I'll fire you." So eventually, Mike became the 11 o'clock producer. He was meticulous in his production skills. His news judgment was excellent. His copy was clean and well written. His broadcasts attracted huge audience at 11 p.m., with names like Dunphy, Story, Green, Stratton, and Keene becoming household words. At one point in history, the big news had more viewers than all the other stations in L.A. combined. Mike Daniels played a major role in that success story, and of course, he never swung at an anchorman. But after a decade of excellence and huge profits for CBS, the inevitable call for change came. Jerry Dunphy was fired, so was I, and immediately hired by KBC, so was I, where the ratings went through the roof. The news directors shuffled fast and furious through Gower Gulch. Would you believe 10 news directors in 10 years? One of those guys invented the so-called news wheel amid great fanfare, and it bombed immediately, the laughing stock of the town. But Mike Daniels hung in there, despite one meathead after another who showed no appreciation for his talents. According to Jose Rios, who's here today, and another Channel 2 survivor, Mike was the first to come up with word that comedian John Belushi had died of a drug overdose. But the powers that be rejected the story, not believing his sources. In 1995, I made the mistake of returning to Channel 2, and there was Mike, running the record room and handing off incoming tapes to producers and writers and reporters with all the enthusiasm he showed as a frontline producer. It was a real waste of talent, but no job was too small for Mike. Most of you know the story about Mike being the model for playwright Neil Simon's Felix Unger and the Odd Couple, the neat freak, the TV news writer, whose counterpart was the disheveled Oscar Madison. That's not what Mike was all about. The real news was the love of Mike's life. He knew the history of L.A. from the Battle of the Cahuenga Pass to the Battle of Chavez Ravine. He knew the McNamara brothers weren't Irish morticians, but a couple of Union anarchists who blew up the L.A. Times in 1910. Some of this may have rubbed off on Mike from his father, J.J. Daniels, a self-appointed Civic Center watchdog who was the scourge of City Hall and the Board of Supervisors for his frequent charges of corruption. When one of his favorite targets, Supervisor Frank Connelly, died, he left behind $1 million in cash and a safe deposit books. There was no investigation, but what did the supervisors do? They named a park after him. Mike took his many talents to the classroom where he scheduled hundreds of young men and women in the art of television news at USC and Loyola Marymount. Don't forget Loyola, Joe. He was also a teacher in the newsroom where he helped scores of production assistants and young writers acquire the tools of the trade they so badly needed. Mike never raised his voice or yelled at anyone. Newman's definition of a gentleman was one who never inflicts pain. That was Mike to a T. He was compassionate and understanding, and despite many a browbeating, never surrendered his quiet dignity to the many fools who populate TV's management ranks. Mike, you will not be forgotten by any of us in your big news family. I'd like to toast you with an old Irish saying. May the road rise to meet you. May the winds always be at your back. May the sun shine warm upon your face, the rains fall soft upon your fields, and until we meet again, may God hold you in the palm of his hand. God bless you, Mike, and thanks for being a friend.
Thank you, Pete. Dan Gingold, who was creating television in the 1950s while Mike was still in school, was Mike's friend both at Channel 2 and USC. Dan?
Thank you, Joe. There's been so much said already about Mike that I feel just a bit redundant. But I'll try maybe to just edit out some of the thoughts I had that have already been spoken. So, my association with Mike dates back more than half a century. When he was at KNX in Columbia Square, and I was directing primitive news broadcasts at KNXT, that time on 1313 Vine Street. Through the years, our paths would cross, and when he came to KNXT, I had the opportunity to see him develop as a talented news writer and as a producer. And though our relationship was professional more than personal, it encouraged me to learn and respect the process of news gathering and producing. Mike Daniels was first and foremost a writer. And when he became a producer, he never lost his passion for the language of communication. He applied that passion to his broadcast responsibilities, but nowhere more so than in the classrooms at USC and Loyola, teaching students to respect and maintain the highest standards of broadcast news. No one enjoyed more love and respect from his students than Mike Daniels. In the weeks since Mike's passing, scores of emails and Facebook postings from colleagues, and students, and others crisscrossed the internet. Expressions of appreciation and gratitude for the impact he had on their lives and careers. These sentiments made me realize how little I really knew about Mike Daniels. Over and over, words just like those mentioned here earlier, like sweet and gentle, patient, humble, helpful, kind, generous, respected, and professional. These words were testament to the universal sentiment shared by those who were privileged to know and to work alongside this revered friend and mentor. So while I haven't much to share about my experiences working with Mike, I would like to pass along some of the observations that sum up his extraordinary effect on colleagues and students. First, of course, the fine obit written by Joe Saltzman for the Annenberg School of Communication and Journalism. It was Joe who launched Mike's teaching career at USC. I'm not going to read all of that obit, but I would like to excerpt a little-known fact that Joe writes about Mike. He was the inspiration for one of the most popular characters in Neil Simon's play The Odd Couple. That would be Felix, described by Simon as the fussy and precise, quote, CBS news writer. As Saltzman points out, Daniels was Felix in the newsroom. As he said, all hell could be breaking around him. Mike would sit there in the eye of the newsroom hurricane, quietly and patiently, putting his newscast together. You may not know it, but there's another famous character allegedly patterned after Mike. The producers of the 1970s Mary Tyler Moore sitcom actually scouted the KNXT newsroom as the setting for their show, and its main characters became larger-than-life caricatures of big news staff. Jerry Dunphy was the model for anchorman Ted Knight. The cantankerous producer Lou Grant grew out of Pete Noyes. And the harried news writer Murray Slaughter was patterned after Mike Daniels. Now, I'm not sure any of this can be verified, but it's a touching and wonderful way to remember Mike. I'd like to also quote a little from some of Mike's other colleagues and associates, even though they may not have given me permission, but I would like to just excerpt from some of the emails. Liz Mitchell posted, in the late 60s, Mike was the producer of the 11 o'clock news, and I was a rookie writer. How he survived my last-minute stories, I'll never know. Years later, when our paths crossed again at USC, he was still the gentle, kind, and amazingly patient soul I had known many years before, and still the consummate newsman. News anchor reporter Terry Murphy wrote, Mike was a sweet guy with a beautiful soul. Bob Simmons wrote, Mike made me feel at home when I first ventured to KNXT in 1963. A nicer guy could not possibly have been in the news business. Linda Cotton remembers, even when he was producing the 11 o'clock news and there was a newsroom party that night, as there were many, he never begrudged those who turned up late and a bit sauced. He simply fell over himself in gratitude if you actually came back to help him put on his show. I'll get there. Reporter Howard Gingold, my brother, by the way, said, I don't recall that he ever uttered a foul word, at least not in my presence. Off the job, he delighted in treating landlubber friends to a cruise aboard his sailboat, named after a favorite wine, the name of which I can't recall. Well, Howard, a former student, Mike Runzler, posted the answer. Runzler writes, I've got great memories, both in the classroom and on the water, aboard the Grand Crew. He was a great teacher, mentor, and friend. According to Saltzman's obit, and I'll take a little of that, Daniels himself explained his philosophy of life in this way. Quote, I grew up at a time when it was unheard of to openly express your opinions that went against the belief of your friends and families. Bite your tongue. Go along with the wisdom of your group. And don't rock the boat. Mike finished by saying, as a lifelong sailor, I know something about boats. They're much more fun when they're rocking. That may have been Mike's true persona, the laid-back Marina del Rey seafarer, adventurer, and wine connoisseur. But in the chaos of the newsroom, he was steady as she goes, a firm hand on the tiller, and a true compass. Thank you, Mike.
Next speaker is a longtime KCBS reporter and a good friend of Mike's, Dave Lopez. Dave.
Thank you. It's very nice to be here. I didn't want to miss it for anything. I first met Mike when I was hired at Channel 2 in 1977. And I had the good fortune of working closely with him. I want to say it was an honor to know Mike for a number of reasons. I also want to take this opportunity to say that I would not be in this business as long as I have lasted, 36 years in June at Channel 2, 41 years in television in Los Angeles, had it not been for two people. Mike Daniels is one, the other is Pete Noyes. Two of the finest gentlemen, finest teachers, finest mentors I ever met. I'm a very, very lucky man. Mike had the great ability. In those days, I was out in the field, and we didn't have the time when you would ship in your pieces edited. That didn't happen. You shipped in your pieces unedited, you would write your track, it would get approved, and then there would be a writer that would put it together for you. I had the great fortune of having Mike Daniels almost be my personal 100% producer. And he made me look 1,000 times better than I should have looked. He had a tremendous ability to put a story together, a tremendous way of making something that I put down on paper come to life, and he became a very good friend of mine. He had a great way of teaching, he had a great way of correcting, and I had the good fortune of having the ability to absorb and listen. Mike was a true gentleman and a gentleman. And I want his family to know that I am very blessed to have crossed his path, because any success I've had in this business, I owe to Mike and to Pete. And I thank you very much.
The next speaker is a late starter because I thought he was dead. That's Joe Sullivan. And if he goes over 5 minutes, I've been asked by the family to physically get up and pull him from the podium. Joe, will you come up and share your wisdom with us?
Pete Noyes said the Irish don't speak ill of the dead. I thought it was my cue. Jesus.
You know that's a fact, Joe.
Pete quotes Irish stuff. You know, that you can't trust an Irishman when it comes to a funeral. You really can't. Mike used to be amazed at the things I would say when I was speaking. I just talked at the interment. I didn't know what to say, but I said something like, "This is not bullshit." And I can hear Mike now, "You said bullshit in front of my rabbi?" Whenever I would intern something down at SC or MC, whatever the case it was, and I just never get prepared. I had the only class down there that everybody was sane, but I was the one that was crazy. Pete once said it was some kind of a funeral that we went to, and somebody said, "Tell Sullivan to keep it down to 5 minutes." He says he takes 5 minutes to bow. I really do. I don't know. Somebody always said, there's an old Irish saying, if you want to get their attention because they're say something shocking at the beginning. That's an old trick, but I can say something shocking. Danny said, you hear all these words: trusting, nice, dedicated. In all the years at Channel 2, Mike never heard those words. Those of you who don't know the newsroom operation, Mike was in charge. What?
Mike, don't touch it, just speak into it.
Touch what you love.
Yeah.
I thought my voice was big enough to reach to the balcony. I'm sorry. And Mike was in charge of assigning writers and reporters to edit rooms. If a reporter came in and he didn't get an edit room, his piece might not get on the air. So all Mike heard in all those years, there isn't anybody that worked at Channel 2 here who hasn't vigorously called Mike every name in the books. Because as you know, with egos, you can't keep us, not us, you can't keep us off the air. Can I have an edit room? What's wrong with this? What did you yell?
I won't repeat it.
Yeah, well, see, you can't repeat the things. And Mike never really heard those words. What it summarizes is that he had the hardest job in the newsroom. He came to work imagine going to work at 9 o'clock in the morning and seeing Joe Saltzman running down the aisle swearing at you. I mean, a lot of this is really true. And when I look back on it, that's the symbol of Mike. Mike took a rough job and really never lost his temper, that I know. He was always very kind, and he was always very thoughtful. And one of the tributes to Mike is all of us at CBS, this is an old homecoming for a lot of people that worked at the big news. And it's so wonderful to see each other again. And we're all telling stories outside and, you know, how much we went together. Not all stories are good because Bill Coppola, that I worked with as a producer at 11, saw me. He said, by the way, do you get out much these days? You know, that's a great greeting to me, you know. Only one other story. I was visiting a former CBS guy in a nursing home, and I was wandering looking for his room, and the nurse came up and said, have you lost your room number? I'll tell you one story about Pete Noyes. See, this is another tribute to Irish speakers at a funeral. They don't speak ill of the dead. Sometimes they don't even mention them. They use some dead person as an excuse to get a resentment against somebody in the audience. So naturally, as I come up here thinking of holy thoughts and inspirational things to say that bring tears to your eyes, I can only think of what I did to Pete one night. He taught in the room opposite me at USC. Pete, it's no secret, he, like every newsman, he likes to be called the legend. So he would call me into his class and say, Joe, come here, say a couple of words. And I would go over, and I would say, Pete is a legend in the business, and a nice guy, you know, say all this nice stuff. So the last time I did it, I thought, this is interesting, make an impression with the students. He says, come on over. So I looked at the students, I said, very serious, and they were all looking. You are truly a legend, Pete. I want you young people who come from all over the world to study journalism and ethics at USC to know that you have one of the great figures in journalism, not only in LA, but internationally and nationally known. A lot of bullshit, you know, but and I said that, and Pete was glowing. So I went back to my classroom, and then I came back in, and I said, I know that. I'm waiting for the punchline. Go low and then go high with the punchline. So Pete's standing there basking in his own glory. And I said to the students, one other thing. I have to tell you this. I don't know of any man who is more courageous in curing himself from AIDS than Pete. The students looked up shocked. Pete looked up shocked. I left the room. And I still haven't been back. But anyway, that's a tribute to Mike. Mike took a lot of abuse. It was a tough job and everything else, but he was a wonderful guy. And the thing is, we can all think. I'm ready to cut. What's that mean? Cut your throat? Okay. No, we can all think of stories about everybody else, and you know, I can't. The tribute to Mike is you can't think of an evil story about Mike. You remembered him, that he was so nice and so dedicated and so thoughtful. And he was the symbol, I think, of the big news. And all writers steal stuff from people. I'll steal one line. I hope I don't offend the new Channel 2 owners, but what the hell. I met Jack Fox, who was an old assignment editor. And I said, you know, it was funny. We used to fight each other all the time in the newsroom, sometimes literally, and fight about everything, and then argue, and we'd be all friends. When the news was over, it's like the argument never happened. We'd be all friends. And I said, boy, it's so different today. Today, if you said a lot of things about people, they'd send a memo to Human Resources. Jack Fox says, in the old days, we were the human resources. And so wasn't Mike, especially Mike. Thank you. All the lines that didn't work on Joe.
I guess he's very much alive. The next speaker, Serena Cha, is a veteran news producer who is now director of USC's Annenberg TV News. She is joined by Tony Cabrera, one of Mike's former students. Serena and Tony.
Thank you. Yeah. Tony and I are honored to be with you. We would like to share with Mike's family and all of you how Mike touched so many generations of teachers and young journalists. I have a similar story that's already been told several times, but you'll indulge me this first part. I first met Mike when I produced the 5 o'clock news at KCBS in the mid-90s. Mike was in charge of making sure reporters, writers, and editors worked together to get every piece of good video on the air. This was the time of OJ, the Kobe, Japan earthquake, Oklahoma City. This was the time of Tricia Toyota, Ann Martin, Michael Tuck, and the return of Jerry Dunphy to Channel 2. Jerry and Mike had their desks right next to each other. Jerry looked at me as people ran back and forth and said, "What kind of place is this? This is insane." Those of you who worked at KCBS during that period know exactly what Jerry was talking about. But right next to Jerry, there was Mike, never panicking, never yelling, never saying a crossword, just helping everyone get it done and get it on the air. He was a pro, and he was our rock. And for the record, I didn't yell at him. Flash forward to USC, I arrived as a fledgling teacher, and right away Joe Saltzman pointed out the best of the best. He had me look at the incredible syllabi that Mike had left behind. Later, we needed teachers for the brand new curriculum. I thought of Mike. To this day, one of the best things I ever did was to persuade him to come back to USC. His return made a difference in many of our lives. Mike was a teacher's teacher. Not only did he teach magnificently, he guided entire teams of teachers. He mentored nervous new teachers. He taught lessons in many classes, not just his own, giving students their first taste of producing. And as our broadcast writing coach, he worked patiently with students one-on-one. Mike shared everything with everyone. Remember his class exercises, his famous PowerPoint keynote illustrations, his crisp writing handouts? We all got help from Mike. I'm talking about Joe Saltzman, Stacy Shoulder, Willis Annenberg, Judy Muller, Barbara Pierce, Graham Robertson, and many more. Mike was generous and kind to all of us. We loved the earnest look on his face when he gave us the serious answers and the wisdom we needed. We loved his smile, we loved his laugh, bubbling up in all of the good talks we had. Everyone loved working with Mike. Annenberg administrators and tech team members. Admit it, no one could ever say no to Mike. He earned the respect of Dana Chin, Chuck Boyles, Tom Norris, who is here today shooting video of this service as we speak. Who else loved Mike? Each and every one of his students, represented here today by Natasha Zuvez, Alvin Abdulsalehi, Vicki Chen, and Sean Patrick Lewis, who are reporting on this service. Here's just one example of Mike's belief in students. A few years ago, some of them were taken aback by a guest speaker's tough talk. Mike sent out a reassuring but honest email after class. These are Mike's own words to his students back in 2010. There is a glowing future for journalism, and specifically broadcast journalism. Indeed, changes are coming. We've already seen many of them, and we'll be seeing a lot more in the coming months and years. We may well be watching more television on our smartphones or such devices than on the big HD TV on the wall. But the public's thirst to know what is going on shows no sign of abating. In fact, we are seeing more and more news information outlets start up and proliferate. More and more reporters are grabbing a camera and a laptop editing system and doing their own packages, something you are being well positioned to do here at Annenberg. So keep positive. Even in this down economy, I see, and I'm sure you see, students getting pretty decent jobs. I have every confidence you will be among them. If I didn't think so, I wouldn't be here. Mike, we know you will always be here in the hearts of the students you've inspired. They are flourishing all over the world. Which brings me to what Mike wrote, as both of us reminisced about a former student we both mentored. These are Mike's words. This punk kid with spiked purple hair skateboarded into my classroom at Loyola Marymount. That's right, skateboarded into the classroom. I remember thinking, well, I guess this is my problem child this semester. How wrong I was. Tony Cabrera became one of my best students. Took an independent studies class with me the next semester, then at my urging, reapplied to Annenberg. We know the rest of the story. Mike went on to write, even though I've never been a parent, I think I have a pretty good idea what it's like. Your kids grow up and make their own decisions. You can only hope you instilled the right values in them to guide those decisions. Mike, you did give your students the right values. Through them, your goodness will continue to touch the world. Here is that skateboarding, purple-haired kid. Oh no, Tony Cabrera.
Thank you. What an introduction. Spiked hair, great.
Sorry.
A mentor is a trusted counselor or guide. That's according to the dictionary. And that's what I thought a mentor was until I met Mike. As Serena said, it all went back to LMU. There wasn't a broadcast journalism program there, but there was one news production class, and Mike Daniels taught it. On the first day of school, like Serena said, I walked in. It was actually bleached blonde hair. It wasn't purple. Purple came a couple of weeks later. And a red electric scooter. I never knew how Mike felt about that first impression until later. He thought I was going to be the problem child of that semester. But you know Mike, he gives everyone a fair shot, and thank God he gave me one. In fact, he saw through my immaturity and recognized a passion, hence his strong suggestion that I transfer to USC for its journalism school. And that changed my life because Mike, the first person I had ever met in the business of broadcast journalism, had decided to invest in my future. Sure enough, I transferred to USC and was again in his classes. Was I the teacher's pet? You betcha. But the way Mike was, everyone felt special. At both USC and LMU, he gave every single student all the attention they deserved. He was even the writing coach, as we heard, giving students that weren't in his class a chance to get better. I can honestly say that Mike was the best teacher I have ever had. He conducted his classes with his TV news producer mentality, keeping our attention the entire time, using the most interactive PowerPoint presentations and the most thoughtful handouts. When he corrected homework, he wouldn't just return it with a couple of red marks throughout the script. He would return it with a whole page of feedback. I've kept them all, including one that starts with, "I'm afraid you really booted this one." We were learning about producing newscasts and had to create our first rundown. Since I wanted to be on air, I didn't take it seriously, of course. But Mike ended it with, "So, you better become a darn good reporter, Tony, because you're not going to make it as a producer with shows like this." Ironically, my first job out of college was a news producer. Mike also devoted time to his students outside of class with the popular Breakfast with Mike, held at this very location. He would always make sure his students had the best seats with the best views of the harbor here. Meals here became very important to my life and career after I graduated. Whenever I was back in town, we would meet here to discuss my next move, the changes in the business, and of course, the latest Apple products. Mike wasn't just a mentor that gave advice, he gave his whole heart and he never judged. Going back to that first job I had as a producer, well, it didn't work out. I requested to get out of my contract early so I can pursue a full-time reporting job. I was so scared to tell Mike. I didn't want to let him down. But of course, with his gentle spirit, he assured me that I could never let him down. He also assured me that my experience as a producer would make me a better reporter, and boy was he right. I fear he was also right about me being the problem student, because a couple years later, I gave up my news reporter career and moved back to LA to pursue something that didn't involve going out to a crime scene every day. So to pay the bills, I became a waiter. This time, I was really, really scared to tell Mike. In fact, I didn't tell him. He reached out to me. Of course, with compassion, even though I'm sure this time he had to take a breather. He had questions and concerns, of course, but guess who was chomping at the bit to sit at one of my tables at the restaurant? Mike Daniels. By the way, his restaurant tips were just as good as his news writing tips. Mike was a mentor that never gave up on anyone, no matter how long it took. He knew I still had a passion for telling stories, and I knew he wanted me back in the game. Sure enough, out of the blue, I got hired as an entertainment correspondent. Mike couldn't be happier. It was like he had a bet going or something. But you know what? I'm so glad I had someone like him rooting for me the entire time, not just in college, but in the 7 years that followed. Mike invested in me for more than a decade, and I'm so grateful for every conversation, every email, every text message, every Facebook message, every single hug. Getting up here and speaking about him is one of the hardest things I've done. But it is the biggest honor. Even though Mike's no longer here, I truly believe his legacy will live on through the lives that he's touched. I will never be able to make an impact like he did, but I do aspire to pass along those teachings. What's great is that my story is just one story, one of many stories that's out there. It's a huge loss for USC. It's a huge loss for LMU. We need more professors like Mike. We need more mentors like Mike. We need more people like Mike. Some of my friends always wanted to be like Michael Jordan. I wanted to be like Michael Daniels. I want to be like Michael Daniels. So I'll leave you with some fitting lyrics that have been in my head all week. If I could be like Mike, I want to be like Mike. Oh, if I could be like Mike. Thank you.
Okay. Mike was the oldest of three brothers. Mark Daniels was his youngest brother and remembers what Mike was like before most of us knew him. So here we have Mark Daniels, his wife Jan, and Zack Snyder, who is a former student of Mike's at Loyola Marymount and is also his teaching assistant. Mike.
I'll go for a seat close. Okay.
Zach.
Well, I just want to start by saying how fitting I think this just this whole setting is. You know, as a student of Mike, and we have many students here, you know, what was important to him? Always have a good OTS, an over-the-shoulder graphic. Always have a really nice visual background. What visual did Mike love more than anything? The sea. So, and also, what was his first lesson that he would always stress and teach on probably the first day of most of his classes? It's all about the people, the people, the people. That's what makes a great news piece. And just how fitting it is to see all these people here today who Mike has touched through USC, LMU, Catalina, Yacht Club, all aspects of his life. And what a life it was, you know? I don't think we can ask for a better example of what it means to truly be a good human being, to truly live by giving back through kindness, teaching. And he is, as many of you have already said, he is always going to be remembered, because you can't even count on fingers and toes how many people that Mike Daniels has touched throughout his career in the newsroom and in the classroom. So I just wanted to say it was real privilege to first be Mike's student, and then to get to work with him for 3 years and see him touch all the other students. And Tony had touched on this, that LMU, we really only had that one class, no formal curriculum like USC. And for those of you in academia here, you know that sometimes it's tough to get classes, and when people are resistant to things, it can be tough. But Mike pressed on, and he always fought to keep that class going. And despite that being one class, Tony's one example, we've had many students from it who have gone on to still have successful careers in the business. So just a true testament to the impact that Mike has had. Thank you.
You know, Zach is a labor of love put together the video tribute to Mike that's on the screen, and I so thank you for that, and it's very, very nice. And, you know, it's said that family, that friends are the family one chooses, and if that's the standard, Mike had one very, very large family, and I might add one very good family, and for that, thank you. And in the last weeks, I have seen so many emails and texts and Facebook postings and heartfelt obituaries and so many things, and I've learned so much about my brother, things that as a brother you might think and not always be exposed to. But in this case, I've seen the expressions of affection and regard for him, and all of how he has touched really so many people. But what has hit me the most is the relationship with his students, and every one of them has a separate and distinct and unique and good story to tell. But the common thread in that seems to be mentor, teacher, friend, and I've heard that from so many people, not just students too, people he's worked with, and it just means so much. And the reason that hits me is that I'm thinking back on my life and saying, well, Mike was also my mentor, my teacher, and my friend. When I was 4 years old, he taught me how to swim. He loved the water when I back then. And as somebody was mentioning, here in my 60s, he's teaching iPod and iPad apps and shortcuts. He was kind of the go-to guy for that. So Mike was my mentor through my life, my mentor, my friend. Above all that, he was my brother, and I'm so proud to have been that, and I'm so proud of him. I'm going to miss him.
Howdy. You know, it was about 25 years ago that the first time I met Mike, it was a date, and I was barfing over the side of his boat when I was dating Mark. And then, after we got engaged, and I said, oh, guess what? I'm going to be your sister, and you're going to be my brother, and whether you like it or not. But you know what? He's the best brother I ever had. I love him dearly, and I miss him terribly. Thank you.
Alan Daniels was Mike's middle brother and will now share his feelings about his sibling with some remembrances. Alan? Oh, Alan.
Hi, everyone. I'm Alan, retired accountant and retired accounting manager, and Mike's middle brother, and I'm almost 7 years his junior. At a very tender age, he showed innate teaching abilities. You know, he had to wait a long time for a little brother to come along, and he just couldn't wait to start teaching that brother things. So I remember as soon as I was 3 years old, he decided to become my Project Head Start. By the time I got to kindergarten, he wanted me to know more than any other little kindergarten kid entering school. So he started me first on numbers. He thought that would be easier than the alphabet, and in fairly short order, he got me to where I could count from 1 to 1,000. And then building on that, he somehow got the idea that he could teach me to tell time. Now, most kids, you know, can't tell time until they're 6 or 7, I don't know what. But somehow he thought that I had a flair for numbers, and he started teaching me how to tell time. And I'm sure there were many times along the way where I just kind of gave up. I just couldn't quite get it, and it was just too young. But then Mike would cajole me, and he would say, please do it for him. He knew I had it in me. And one way or another, he actually taught me how to tell time at 3.5 years old. I could do it, including the second hands to boot.
You still can't be on time now.
Now, I had to wait a few months for this to happen, but I remember the happiest birthday of all I ever had was my 4th birthday, because on that birthday I received my very own little kid's wristwatch. I mean, how many kids 4 years old wear wristwatches? But I did. So anyway, after he taught me to tell time and I knew the numbers and everything, next thing he wanted to make sure I knew all the letters and how to read and how to spell a little bit. So I'd say maybe in kindergarten I could spell maybe at a first or second grade level. Well, here's where Mike tried to press his luck as a teacher. He came home from his 6th grade class. This is a 6th grade vocabulary word that he had, and it was the state Mississippi. So he said that he knows this is going to be kind of tough, but would I please try my hand at trying to spell that word? So I start out, I know Mrs., of course, that can't be too tough, capital M-R-S period. So he said, well, that's not quite right. Think about it again, about the word. And again, it came out, what else did I know about but capital M-R-S period? So then he knew that our dad had been teaching me baseball, and he knew that I knew the word misses. Batter comes to the plate and swings and misses. So he said, instead of thinking of a married woman, maybe to think of the line along the lines of misses. So of course I can start at M-I-S-S-E-S, at which time so far I'm only one letter away. So now he tells me to try and break the word down. He says, well, break it down to 2 parts. There's Mrs. and then there's sippy. Well, I didn't know what that was. I knew what Mrs. was, but what is a sippy anyway? So anyway, I tried, and I tried S-I-P-P-Y, and then I tried S-I-P-P-E-E and E-Y, and finally got to the S-I-P-P-Y, the S-I-P-P-I. But try as he might, and bless he might, he never could coax the 5th letter of that word Mississippi as an I out of my 5-year-old mouth. The closest I got was M-I-S-S-E-S S-I-P-P-I. But it sure wasn't for lack of trying. And there were 2 things that Mike could never get me to, that he could never teach me in life. He could never, when I was 5 years old, get me to say I as the 5th letter of the word Mississippi. And then later on, he never could get me to love USC, since I went to UCLA, and I'm a UCLA graduate. But even as a UCLA graduate, I have to admit that the Annenberg School of Broadcast Journalism is just the best, and I'm so proud of Mike that he was affiliated with so many august people. Pete Noyes, and then Gingold, and Dave Lopez, and then again at the SC. With CBS News. I'm sorry, I got that wrong. That's with CBS News, and at USC would be Joseph Saltzman and other fine people. So he was kind of a titan, even in his own right. He won 3 Emmy Awards in connection with the CBS, the big news at CBS. With Jerry Dunphy, and very, very proud of those achievements. Very proud to call Mike Daniels my brother. I've always loved him, and I always will. Thank you very much.
Lou Varela is a former Channel 2 cameraman who Mike convinced to join the California Yacht Club years ago, and they remain great boating friends. Lou, oh, there you are.
Gave away all my material.
Stick to yachting.
Yeah. I met Mike in 1967, so we go back a long ways. When I first met Mike, the first day he brought me aside because I was working the late shift and he was producing the 11. And the first thing he would say to me, if you need anything, if you want to know anything, come talk to me. And I did. I always went and talked to him. I asked him questions about this or that. And he was always very helpful. And then 2 years later, Pete Noyes gave me a job as an apprentice cameraman. We only shot film in those years from 67 to 77. And again, Mike comes up and says, if you need any help, lining up with editors and see how you do your stuff, how you shoot, what to look for, blah, 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 come talk to me. So I did. And he would set me up with editors to show the pieces that I shot. He's just helpful, talking to different people. And then in in 77, or actually 78, after I've been, working for 10 years or so in the field, Mike, I was living in the Marina then, and Mike came to, and I thought, well, I live in the Marina. I'd like to learn how to go boating. So I went and talked to Mike, because he's the one who knew everything about boating. So Mike took me aside and say, here's the boat for you right here. I got a friend who's selling a boat, so I bought his boat. And then later on, I sold that boat and I bought a sailboat. And Mike says, well, you can't go out sailing unless I show you how to sail. So now Mike took me out and he showed me how to sail. And for years, that was Mike. Every time I needed anything or help, assistance, friendship, he was always there. And we were very good friends. And then when we had the 2800 Dock Club, that was our dock where Mike was the dock father, somebody had mentioned earlier. Every summer we went to Catalina and he arranged everything. And then when the docks were taken down to build new docks, Mike joined the California Yacht Club. And so he comes to me and says, you need to join the, oops, sorry. Sorry, I apologize for that. Stronger than I thought I was. Anyway, he says, you need to join the California Yacht Club. So here I am with Mike Downs here at the California Yacht Club. And he has been an inspiration for 46 years and the best friend a man could ever have. And I'm going to miss him a lot. Thank you very much.
Dennis Connolly is the former manager of the California Yacht Club who recruited Mike to join the club. And as they say, that was the beginning of a beautiful friendship. Dennis?
That's the way to do it.
Thank you very much. I wrote some notes down, but in honor of Mike, I actually put it down on an iPad, and I've never done this before, so I hope this works for me. So listen, I really appreciate hearing all the stories and accolades from the different friends and colleagues that are here and who've been in touch with Michael's life in all the different capacities. I see friends of fellow yacht club managers. Actually, Michael was a member of several yacht clubs, and quite a few are here today. I'm very honored to share with you just a couple of experiences that I've had with him over the last 22 years. I first met Michael in 1991, actually on Catalina Island, and it was on the west end of the island in late August. And I had been volunteering at a summer camp over there since 1977 at Emerald Bay. Many of you have probably been to the island. It's a Boy Scout camp, and it had been there since 1925. And about 3 weeks before the camp was going to close for the summer season, the alumni and the staff got word that the island company was not going to renew the lease at the end of the year, and it was a complete shock to all of us. So a few of us older alumni got together and tried to figure out what could we do to save this camp. Well, there happened to be one guy on staff, Steve Zimmerman, who, interestingly enough, was an intern at CBS, and he knew a man named Michael Daniels, and Mike had a boat at the Isthmus, so we piled in a small little Gregor, 4 of us, and we putted over to the Isthmus and looking around for this Mike Daniels. We didn't know his boat, we didn't know where he was. Steve knew what he looked like, and sure enough, we found him on his mooring in a Delta 24 on Kilo 15, and there he was, no shirt on, khaki shorts, just in the sun, having with his. At the time, he drank Michelob Light, and he sat there. He was just enjoying life. So he invited us on board, and we told him our story, and we really didn't know why. We had kind of heard, and he listened very patiently and listened. And he kind of afterwards said, there's not a lot I can do. I've retired from CBS, although I do have probably some strings there. So let me think about it for a little bit. So we came back a few days later, and Michael said to us, he said, your story is very compelling because it was the Jacques Cousteau Society that was going to come and take the place of the Boy Scouts. Now, typical story, you got good and evil. And unfortunately for us, we were a lessee and we really had no rights. So, they could kick us out if they wanted to. But Michael thought, this is a great news story. It's good versus good. and we don't get that very often. So he pulled some strings, and the next thing you know, we had 1 week left, and he organized, and this is a long time ago, so I don't take anything with CBS, but he organized to have a helicopter fly all the way over there with a cameraman and with a reporter. And they landed on the island without a permit and went up and put the microphone and watched the little kids leave the camp, and they were waving goodbye. Please don't take our camp away. We want to come back next year. And it was just pulling on the heartstrings. And of course that hit the 6 o'clock news. All the other news stations, where did they get this information? What is all this about? So they started clamoring. And we had a couple of months before the lease was to expire, and we had no good news to report. So we decided we were going to put together a little protest in front of the Cousteau Society, and their field office was in Santa Monica on Santa Monica Boulevard. And so we notified everybody again, all the news stations, and of course they have to follow their leads. And they called the Boy Scout Council. The council didn't know anything about it because it was just us volunteers. And they called the island. The island was furious. They knew nothing about it. So all of a sudden the whole thing was canceled. NBC, ABC, KTLA, all the news stations, they said, we're not covering it. So we called Michael and said, Michael, please, we are going to go. We are going to have this protest. And we managed to get about 20 little scouts with their uniforms and their signs and their picket signs. And and the news is wonderful because you can take 20 kids and make it look like 200. And so they're up and down, and please, Mr. Cousteau, don't take our camp away from us. Well, he got the message all the way in France, and he pulled out. And as a result of Michael's efforts and the Emerald Bay alumni and all the people that put so much time in, we actually got the LA County Board of Supervisors, all 5 of them, to unanimously write a resolution that the Scouts should stay on the island for another 60, 70 years. And that it was due very much in part to the efforts and help from Mike Daniels. And so the tens of thousands of kids that rotate through that camp every summer greatly appreciate that. So yes, I was the manager here of California Yacht Club from 1991 till 1999, and kind of helped Mike sponsor Mike into the club. And I remember him asking me in the beginning. He was over in the 2800 Club, 2800 dock, across the way in the other basin. He said, well, what am I going to get by joining your club? I'm going to have to pay dues, and that's going to entitle me to come back and pay for food in the dining room, and then I have to pay for my slip. What am I going to get? And so, I told him, I said, Michael, you're going to become part of a much, much bigger family, far bigger and far more reaching than you can ever imagine. And absolutely, this club, CYC, really became Michael's home. And I'd like to just share one more quick story. I know we've been out here and it's getting cold. But Michael used to nickname me as his personal rum runner. I have a little 24-foot center console boat, and I'd go to the Catalina all the time. And my boat was always stocked with Captain Morgan's rum and Diet Coke for the Skinny Pirate thing. But Michael changed from his Michelob Light to Chardonnay, which is the reason I have a glass here. That'll come up in a minute. And so I would be his rum runner, and I would go to Costco and get the greatest bottle of $12 Chardonnay I could find and load my boat up and take it across. So I get in over here, go down the fairway, till just before I got to the breakwater, I'd get my cell phone and give Mike a call and say, is this Mike Daniels? Yes, it is. Is this my rum runner? Yes, it is. I said, Michael, I'm going to be leaving the breakwater. I will be there in exactly 1 hour and 10 minutes. If you don't see me in 1 hour and 15 minutes, call out the Coast Guard. And it didn't matter if it was calm seas or blowing 20 knots with rough seas. That little boat, I just powered through it, and dripping wet by the time I got there, just roaring around Shiprock at about 20 knots or 28 knots, and then pulled in, and there was Mike with his stopwatch waiting patiently for me. He'd come in, he helped me tie up, we offload the stowaway goods, and then sit on the back end of his boat and just have a marvelous time. One of my favorite memories with Mike is on sitting on the back of his boat on Romeo 3, and he would always have cocktail hour whenever I got there, or whenever guests were there. And for those of you that were privileged ever to be on his boat, he always recorded sunset, and you, as a guest, had to help him do that. And way down below, he had a ship's log, and where his mooring was up against the hillside, and there's a ridge. But as the sun is setting, it hits the ridge. Well, of course, as the months go by, the sun, moves, and the ridge is not flat. So it comes way down and then goes back up. So sunset can be, 45 minutes difference when you're sitting on his mooring from month to month. And but you'd call it out, and he knew exactly when it was. And if he was up to 30 seconds off, it was because the tide was up or the tide was down. Anyway, we became, again, very, very good friends and shared things that only two really close friends could do. And I remember Michael telling me that one of his favorite times was Sunday afternoons at about 5:45 when the ferry would take off. Because all the tourists and people that came for the weekend had to get off the island. It was the only way off unless you had a campsite or something. So we would sit there with our Chardonnay and watch them all line up on the dock on the pier, go down the gangway like perfectly trained little penguins marching along, and catching one last glimpse of the island, the beautiful orange Garibaldi and the opaleye fish that would be swimming all around. It was Michael's paradise. This is where he loved to be. So, my friends, it's time for us to send Michael off for one final sunset cruise. And there's an old sailor's benediction. I'd like to make a toast, if anybody still has a glass with them, to my great friend Michael, and my mentor. Now it is time to part. And as we do, may God grant you safe harbors, fair winds, and following seas. And may he hold you in the hollow of his hand until we meet again. Here's to Michael.
Bob Harmon was Mike's student at USC, worked with Mike at Channel 2, was a boater friend and a member of the 2800 dock, and is now following in Mike's footsteps as a teacher. So he covers all bases. Bob.
I'm going to take us back to the Michelob days, if you don't mind. So, for those of you who don't know me, I was all that. But for many years, I was also privileged to be the dinghy cabin boy for Mike Daniels. Now, none of us could never figure out what a dinghy cabin boy was supposed to do, but the pay was real good. All the beer I could drink and lunch aboard Grand Cru. And Joe, what you missed out by not going out sailing with Mike was lunch aboard Grand Cru, which in the last couple of weeks, as I've thought back on these thousands of memories with Mike Daniels, it keeps going back to lunch, because he would serve the best lunch. In the old days, I call the Pioneer Boulangerie days, it would be a shepherd's repast sandwich with a side of slaw, served up on color-coordinated plastic plates with color-coordinated cutlery. I didn't think I was going to get that word out. And color-coded napkins, and of course an ice-cold, color-coded can of Michelob beer. So that was life aboard Grand Cru, and I can still taste those sandwiches now. As Joe mentioned, I first met Mike as a student, and I can't really repeat what Tony said so eloquently, except that he took a young and wacky kid and gave him focus. A couple of years later, he was responsible for getting me my first internship at KNXT, and that turned into a job and turned into a career. And all along the way, Mike was there to mentor and then get me into my first boat, which just happened to be on the 2800 dock. During those years, I learned that Mike went by a lot of different names. There was Mike, which we all knew him by. At school, he would be Mr. Daniels, or in some cases, Professor Daniels, because inevitably, every semester, there's 2 or 3 students who think that if you're teaching classes at a university level, you're automatically a professor, and I'm not going to begrudge Mike that at this time. And then at sea, there was Captain Mike and Skipper Mike, or just Skipper. And there was Harbor Mike, and I want to dwell on that for a second, because that is a career of Mike's that we have not discussed yet throughout this day. Harbor anything was when they were over at the island at the Isthmus, the staff there would talk to each other. The patrol boats would go by Harbor 1 or Harbor 2 or Harbor 3, and then there was Harbor Office and Harbor Store and Harbor Doug.
who was the big boss, and then there was Harbor Mike. And Harbor Mike got called in on the busy weekends when newcomers would come to the island who didn't know where their mooring was or didn't quite know how to pick up their mooring, and they'd call out Harbor Mike. And out he would buzz out the fairway in Petite Crew, his dinghy, ready to help out, taking skipper in hand, showing him the mooring. I mean, I can picture him now, one hand deftly handling the engine of Grand Cru, the other wrapped around a can of Michelob beer, pointing out directions. Skipper, do this. Skipper, do that. You're doing great. You're doing fine. The skipper would pick up, get moored in. Mike would give him that Mike Daniels smile with the thumbs up. Welcome to the island, skipper, and then off he'd go to make his next call. But of all his names, I think one that was mentioned here earlier was his absolute favorite, and that was as the Dock Father. And that takes us to 2800 Dock, no yacht club, but just a little dock that used to exist way down in A Basin. It's gone now. But there was a period of time when every person who was on that dock was part of a bigger family. And it would take me hours to try and describe what 2800 Dock Club was, but we were just one event after another. There wasn't a day that we missed. Oktoberfest, Cinco de Mayo, Christmas Boat Parade, the dock versus the apartment penthouse Christmas party caroling contest, which I really don't want to go back to because we were so tight. Well, I have this bag up here. We actually even had our own burgee. And I think most members of the 28 Dock Club still have their burgees. And we designed it. I mean, the design of the burgee was intentional. It's the dock in the middle, the tan of the dock or the wood. The green on the outside represented the container gardens. Every boat on that dock had a container garden, and we would try to outdo each other with our container gardens. But as a result, our dock kind of became known as sort of like the Camelot, if you will, of Marina del Rey. And some of the biggest events that we had, I think were mentioned, and you can see pictures of them in there. Every year, Mike would arrange what we called a green trip over to Catalina Island about this time of year. It was a day trip aboard the express boat, but the island was actually green, which is why we called it the green trip. And we'd go and he'd arrange people to give us special tours and stuff, and we'd spend the day over there just enjoying the island and coming back. And then in midsummer, usually about early June, we would have what we called the 2800 Dock Club cruise. And that was, I don't even know how to adequately describe the 2800 Dock Club cruise. We all came over, we had a big barbecue on Friday night, and then a rowdy dinner at Doug's Harbor Reef on Saturday night. As Mark mentioned earlier today, I mean, we got to the point where there would be 70 plus people at those dinners, and they just kind of got out of control with a lot of unnecessary roasting and toasting, and I discovered buffalo milk then, and as a result, I don't drink alcohol anymore. But they were some great times. I mean, and then we had also the Aeolus Cup race every year. There's a picture on the table from that, which was just a dock boat race. And really, it was the post-race brunch and award ceremony that I think we put more effort into than the race itself. But like all good things, I mean, I said we were kind of like the Camelot of Marina del Rey, and you know, even Camelot had to come to an end at some point, and its great leader taken by a wooden boat, coincidentally enough, to the island of Avalon, leaving behind for us a lesson that. Though the fate of this man and that man is really less than a drop of water in the motion of a blue and sunlit sea, every once in a while those drops sparkle. Mike certainly was one of the sparkling drops, and I think we were all very lucky to have been in the presence of that sparkle and feel his light, and I think we all will continue to feel that throughout his life. I know I will. There was also a tradition at the 2800 Dock Club that we would do a presentation of some sort during these big parties, usually unannounced, and we tried to make sure that the recipient of said presentation really had no idea what was about to come. And I tried to think of something that could adequately thank, Mike Daniels for my sake, for a lifetime of teaching and mentorship and being a colleague and being a fellow boatnik and being kind of a guiding light and a shelter in the storm. There was one time, there was one little piece of payback. Back in 1992, Will Robinson and I dumped KCBS during the height of the Lippman era, and we went down to San Diego to work for an America's Cup campaign. This was a big deal for me. I'd been an America's Cup fan since I was a little boy, and I was really lucky. Well, the team, the syndicate that we went to work for survived the pre-trials and actually got into the best-of-7 finals to defend the Cup against the Italians. We were allowed as staff members to bring people down as guests, and it just worked out that the day that Mike and Russ Stumpus, who was also a member of the Dot Club, were able to come down was on the 5th race of the series, which just happened to be the final race of the series. We won the Cup that day, and if you've ever been to an America's Cup, the party starts out at the finish line and goes all the way in, and then there's huge celebrations at the Yacht Club, and there was a big party that night at the compound, and I was lucky enough to get Mike and Russ into the party, and it was a big thrill for me at this part of my life to have these two comrades from 2800 Dot Club there with me to share it. And there was one point where we were up by where the Cup was being displayed, and Bill Koch, who was the skipper and owner of the syndicate, stopped by, and somebody took a picture. We have that picture, and oddly enough, about a month ago, Mike called me, actually emailed me, and asked, do I still have a copy of that picture? He'd like it. And I thought, yeah, it's somewhere buried in my house, but I'll find it for you. And I was planning to come down next month and see him anyway, so I'll just bring it then. Well, obviously that didn't happen, but I did find the picture, and what I'd like to do now is present it to Mark and to Alan. And I'd like you to, and it is Mike and Russ and Bill Koch and the America's Cup and I, and I'd like you to keep it, if you would, with his memories. And thank you very much. And I hope that when Mike looks down on his memories and the sale that we're signing and all that, he'll remember that day and all the days we spent together, and all the people here who love him so very, very much. Thank you.
It is now my pleasure to welcome to the podium John Isaksen, a club friend of Mike's, who will conduct a very special ceremony that will conclude today's official program. John? Oh, there you are. Okay.
Thank you very much. I'm very proud to be standing before you as a very good friend of Mike's as well. And one thing that Mike did for the club, again, was in communications. And he, together with Diane Adler, who is sitting here, the beautiful lady back here about 4 rows, they edited and reviewed our club publication, The Breeze, every month for many, many years. And Mike, no matter how you would ask a question of him, he knew everything that would be grammatically correct, and he was into that position and did a wonderful job. As communications got on, of course, we got into the world of Apple communications. And again, there wasn't anybody better at iPads, iPhones, and all the rest than Mike. As a matter of fact, every time a new iPhone came on the market, Mike had to have the first one. An iPad, he had to have the first one before anybody else. He rigged away, I don't know if he had a special communication with Steve Jobs, but he got the first. And in doing that, of course, a lot of us followed in his footsteps, and all of a sudden we had about 20 people in the club that had iPads, but of course he was the guru. He knew better than anybody how to make them work. We were sitting around a table one day, and we're looking at each other, and Mike said, you know, looking at our physiques, he said, this kind of gives a whole new meaning to the Apple Dumpling Gang. But at any rate, a yacht club is full of tradition, and certainly California Yacht Club stands tall in that area. And what we typically do in these situations is have the ringing of the 8 bells, which basically signify the end of a watch for a person that has really performed very well for the club. And with that as well, we will be lowering the flag, having taps, and we had also planned on honoring Mike with a cannon salute, which, with the situation back east and so on and so forth, and the way we shoot a cannon here at the club, a large brass cannon, it would reverberate throughout the whole marina, and we don't want law enforcement jumping down our throats. So we have something else planned because, again, Diane Adler has been our club cannoneer, so she can sit back and relax, and Scott Jarema, who usually packs the cannon with all types of loud noises, will do something else instead. Scott?
In lieu of the cannon shot, we'll open up a bottle of champagne for Mike in his honor. I will say fire in the hole, and if we could have Evan, if you could come over and help with the flag. At this time, we will lower the flag, and we will play taps. And Commodore Isaksen, will you sound 8 bells? Fire in the hole. Thank you, Mike.
That concludes our program. On behalf of the Daniels family, I want to thank all of the speakers who have given us such warm memories of such a good friend. So let's eat and be merry as we remember what a grand fellow Mike Daniels was, a man who brought so much joy to so many, and who, since he always had a stopwatch, would remind me we ran over.